On a Thursday morning in February of 2021, the temperature in Marshall County, Kansas dropped to 11 degrees below zero and stayed there for 4 days. The power grid buckled under the weight of it. Transformers blew in the night with sounds like rifle shots echoing across frozen fields. Propane lines froze solid. Natural gas pressure dropped so low that furnaces couldn't maintain a pilot flame. By Friday morning, the county emergency management office had opened the high school gymnasium as a warming shelter, and the parking lot was filling up with people who hadn't planned on needing a place to go. Let me tell you about what the inside of a house feels like when the furnace quits at 11 below. It doesn't happen all at once. The house holds its warmth for a while, the way a body holds warmth after the heart stops. An hour passes, and you think maybe it isn't so bad. 2 hours pass, and you notice the windows have fogged on the inside. By the third hour, you can see your breath in the kitchen, and the children are awake and asking questions you don't have good answers to, and the thermostat reads 51 degrees and is still falling. That is what happened to roughly 400 households in the county that weekend. 400 families who had modern, efficient, properly installed, recently inspected heating systems that simply stopped working when the world got cold enough to matter. And then there was Nora Lindgren. Let me tell you about Nora Lindgren because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from every character this channel has told you about. Most of the stories told here are about old men who knew something the young men forgot. This one is about a 23-year-old woman who knew something her neighbors had decided they didn't need to know anymore, and who spent a very long weekend being warm while the county froze around her, and who spent the years after that trying to explain to anyone who would listen what had actually happened and why. Nora was 23 years old in February of 2021. She had grown up on her family's farm at the edge of Marysville, the county seat, on 280 acres that her great-grandfather Arvid Lindgren had broken from prairie sod in 1931. Her father, Gunnar Lindgren, was 61 years old and had farmed that same ground his entire adult life. He was a methodical man, a careful man, the kind of farmer who kept his equipment maintained and his records straight and his opinions mostly to himself. He had installed a high-efficiency propane furnace in the farmhouse in 2009, the same year Nora was in the 8th grade, and he had been quietly proud of the fuel savings ever since. The old cast-iron wood-burning stove that had heated the house since 1947 had been pushed into the corner of the mudroom when the new furnace went in, and it had sat there for 12 years serving as a surface for setting boots and seed catalogs and the occasional coffee cup. Nora had studied environmental science at Kansas State University in Manhattan, graduating in 2019 with a degree that her father described to his neighbors as something to do with soil, which was not entirely wrong. She'd come back to the farm after graduation with a notebook full of ideas and a habit of asking why that her father found equal parts admirable and exhausting. She had spent her junior year writing a research paper on residential heating resilience in rural communities, a paper that had been supervised by a professor named Dr. Elaine Kowalski, who had spent 20 years studying energy infrastructure vulnerability in the Great Plains. The paper's central argument was simple enough. Modern high-efficiency heating systems were designed for efficiency, not resilience, and their efficiency came at the cost of redundancy. The tighter the system, the more ways it had to fail. Nora had come home from college with that paper and a set of conclusions and a plan that she had laid out at the kitchen table one evening in the spring of 2020, about 9 months before the ice storm. Let me tell you about that kitchen table conversation because it is where this story actually begins. even though nothing dramatic happened at it. Gunnar Lindgren was eating supper. His wife, Britt, was at the counter. Nora sat across from her father with a folder of printed pages and a cup of coffee, and said that she wanted to restore the wood stove in the mudroom to working condition. Gunnar set down his fork. He looked at the folder. He looked at his daughter. He said, "We have a furnace." Nora said she knew that. She said the furnace was excellent, and she wasn't suggesting they replace it. She was suggesting they restore the backup. She had researched the stove's manufacturer, a company called Monarch that had made cast-iron kitchen and heating stoves in the Midwest from the 1890s through the 1960s. The stove in their mudroom was a 1947 Monarch parlor heater, a freestanding unit designed to heat roughly 1,200 square feet on a single load of hardwood. It had been installed by Arvid Lindgren the year he built the mudroom addition. The firebox lining was cracked in one place but otherwise intact. The flue damper worked. The stovepipe connection to the chimney was sound. The whole restoration, Nora estimated, would cost about $340 in parts and one weekend of work. Gunnar picked his fork back up. He said, "Why?" Nora had expected this question. She opened the folder and pulled out a single page. She said that in the previous 30 years, Marshall County had experienced 11 significant winter weather events that caused extended power outages. She said that the average duration of those outages was 41 hours. She said that the county's current housing stock was 94% dependent on systems requiring either electricity, natural gas pressure, or propane delivery for heat. She said that the 1947 Monarch parlor heater required none of those things. It required wood, which they had in the form of the hedge apple grove along the north fence line, and it required someone to feed it, which she was volunteering to be. Britt Lindgren, who had been standing at the counter through all of this, said, without turning around, "She's right, you know." Gunnar Lindgren looked at his wife's back. He looked at his daughter's folder. He said, "I'll think about it." He thought about it for 2 weeks, and then one Saturday morning he came into the mudroom, looked at the old Monarch stove for a long time, and said, "All right, let's see what we're dealing with." Now let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because you need to understand Dale Crowley before you can understand what happened at the Marysville Co-op that June. Dale Crowley was 58 years old and had run Crowley Heating and Cooling out of a shop on the east side of Marysville for 26 years. He was the kind of man who held court at the co-op counter on Tuesday mornings, the kind whose opinion on anything mechanical was offered freely and received as authoritative by the men who gathered there. He had installed roughly 340 furnaces in Marshall County over his career, including the Lindgren Propane unit in 2009. He drove a clean, white service truck with his name on the door in blue letters, and he wore a blue uniform shirt with the same name on the chest, and he was proud of both. He had won the Better Business Bureau's Regional Service Award 3 years running. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent 26 years becoming certain that he knew what good heating looked like, and that certainty had calcified into something that looked a great deal like contempt for any suggestion that it might look different. Nora had run into Dale at the co-op in June of 2020, 8 months before the ice storm. She had been there to pick up a bag of boiler cement for the firebox repair, and had made the mistake of mentioning it to the man behind the counter, who had mentioned it to Dale, who was sitting on a stool near the window with a cup of coffee and an opinion he was about to share. Dale said, "You're patching that old Monarch? What for?" Nora said it was for backup heat. Dale said, "Backup heat?" He said it the way people say things when they're really saying something else. He looked at the two men near him, and one of them smiled. Dale said, "Your dad's furnace got a problem I should know about?" Nora said, "No, the furnace was fine." Dale said, "Then what do you need a wood stove for? You know what those things put out in particulates? You know what the county air quality standards say about open combustion appliances?" Nora said she did know, and that a properly maintained cast iron stove with seasoned hardwood fuel was well within county air quality guidelines, and that the EPA's current exemption framework for residential wood-burning appliances in rural counties with populations under 50,000 specifically covered the type of unit she was restoring. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Dale Crowley started laughing. Let me tell you about that laugh, because it matters. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has decided that the person speaking doesn't understand the world well enough to be taken seriously, and who is communicating that decision as efficiently as possible. It was the laugh that says, "I have been doing this for 26 years, and you have been doing this for approximately never. And the gap between those two things is so large that I don't need to argue with you. I can just laugh." It was the laugh of a man protecting something, though Dale Crowley could not have told you what. He said, "Honey, I've been heating houses in this county since before you were born. Nobody heats with wood anymore. There's a reason for that." Nora said, "What's the reason?" Dale said, "Because we have better options." Nora said, "Better at what?" Dale said that he had work to do, and he picked up his coffee cup, and the conversation was over. Nora drove home with her boiler cement. She told her father what had happened. Gunnar Lindgren listened and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Well, he's not wrong that we have better options. He's just wrong about what better means." They spent the following Saturday restoring the Monarch. The cracked firebox brick came out in 3 pieces and was replaced with a pre-cut refractory brick from a stove restoration supplier in Topeka. The flue collar was resealed with the boiler cement. The damper rod was cleaned and oiled. The stovepipe sections were inspected. 2 were replaced, and the chimney connection was cleared of a bird's nest that had been there for at least 3 years. When they lit the first test fire that afternoon, the stove drew cleanly and the heat rolled out into the mudroom within 20 minutes. Nora stood with her hands out over the open-top plate and felt the warmth coming up and thought about Dr. Kowalski's paper and the 11 power outages in 30 years and the 41-hour average and said nothing. Gunnar stood next to her and watched the fire for a while and said, "Your great-grandfather heated this house with that stove for 22 years. Nora said she knew. Gunnar said he never lost a winter. They cut and split 8 cords of hedge apple from the north fence line that fall, which Nora stacked in the lean-to shed behind the mudroom. Hedge apple, also called Osage orange, is one of the densest hardwoods native to the Great Plains, with a BTU output per cord that rivals hickory and exceeds oak. It burns hot and long and leaves a minimal ash bed. Nora knew this because Dr. Kowalski's seminar had included a fuel comparison table, and because she had cross-referenced it with the Kansas State Extension Bulletin on native hardwood fuel values, and because she was the kind of person who cross-referenced things. 8 cords of hedge apple represented, by her calculation, approximately 180 million BTUs of stored heat energy, enough to heat the farmhouse through 3 average Kansas winters without the furnace running at all. Dale Crowley, had he known about the 8 cords of hedge apple, would have laughed again. Let me tell you about the science, because it is the part of this story that Dale Crowley never asked about, and it is the part that explains everything that came after. Modern, high-efficiency propane and natural gas furnaces are engineering achievements. A 96% efficient condensing furnace loses only 4 cents of every dollar of fuel to waste heat. It cycles on and off with precision, maintaining temperature within a degree or two of the thermostat setting, and it does this automatically without human attention for years at a time. It is, by every metric that the heating industry uses to measure itself, a better product than a cast iron wood stove. It is more efficient, more convenient, more precise, and cleaner in operation. Dale Crowley was not wrong about any of this. What Dale Crowley had not considered, or had considered and dismissed, was the question of what happens when the system the furnace depends on fails. A 96% efficient propane furnace requires 4 things to operate: a propane supply at adequate pressure, an electrical connection for the igniter and blower, a functioning thermocouple or flame sensor, and an exhaust pathway that isn't blocked by ice or debris. Remove any one of these 4 things, and the furnace stops. It doesn't degrade gracefully. It doesn't produce 60% of its rated output. It produces 0. The efficiency that makes it excellent in normal conditions is the same design philosophy that makes it binary in abnormal ones. Either it works completely or it doesn't work at all. A cast iron wood stove requires one thing: fuel. It has no electrical components. It has no pressure requirements. It has no sensors. It has no exhaust fan. It operates on the same thermodynamic principle it operated on in 1947, which is the same principle it operated on in 1847. Hot gas rises, cold air falls, combustion produces heat, the iron holds and radiates that heat into the room. You can operate it with a cracked firebox brick, a slightly misaligned damper, a bent stovepipe. It degrades gracefully. It is, by every metric the heating industry uses, an inferior product. It is also the product that keeps working when everything else stops. Dr. Kowalski had a phrase for this distinction. She called it the difference between optimized systems and resilient systems. An optimized system, she wrote, is designed to perform at maximum efficiency under normal conditions. A resilient system is designed to perform at adequate efficiency under abnormal conditions. The error rural communities had made, she argued, was in assuming that the optimized system was also the resilient one, because it was newer and more expensive and came with a warranty. It wasn't. It had never been designed to be. It had been designed to be efficient, and efficiency and resilience are not the same thing, and in a place where winters can kill you, the difference between those two things is not an academic question. Nora had underlined that paragraph in her paper copy of the study. She had underlined it twice. The winter of 2020 into 2021 was a cold one across the central Great Plains, but nothing unusual through December and January. The propane furnace in the Lindgren farmhouse ran normally. The Monarch stove sat in the mudroom, clean and ready, and Nora fed it a small fire on weekend mornings to keep the chimney warm and the flue draft established, a practice her father watched with the quiet tolerance of a man who has decided to let someone prove their point in their own time. The ice storm arrived on the night of February 10th, 2021. It came in from the northwest as a combination of freezing rain and sleet that coated every surface in the county with a 1/4 inch of ice before midnight, followed by a temperature drop that hit 11 below zero by Thursday morning and did not recover above zero for 4 days. The power grid in Marshall County had been built for the loads of a normal Kansas winter, which can be cold, but is rarely this cold for this long. The demand spike that hit on Thursday morning was 340% of the February baseline. Transformers in 3 of the county's 5 distribution substations failed within 6 hours of each other. By noon on Thursday, 62% of the county was without power. The propane system failed for a different reason. The county's propane distribution network was adequate for normal winter demand, but the combination of the temperature drop and the power outages created a cascading failure. Without electricity, the circulation pumps at 2 of the county's 3 propane distribution terminals couldn't operate. Delivery trucks couldn't run their routes because county roads were glazed with ice, and the county road department's trucks were themselves disabled by the cold. Residential propane tanks that were less than 40% full experienced pressure drops that fell below the minimum operating threshold for high-efficiency condensing furnaces, which require a minimum inlet pressure of 11 inches of water column to maintain ignition. Tanks that were 40% full in normal conditions were effectively empty in these ones. By Thursday evening, the County Emergency Management Office had received 847 calls from residents reporting heating failures. The Lindgren farmhouse was warm. Let me tell you about what those 4 days looked like from inside the farmhouse, because it is not a dramatic story in the way you might expect. There was no moment of crisis, no scramble, no desperate improvisation. Nora had built a fire in the Monarch at 6 in the morning on Thursday, when the temperature outside was already dropping fast, before the power went out, before the propane pressure dropped, before the first transformer blew. She had built it because she had checked the weather the night before, and the forecast had said 11 below, and she had thought about Dr. Kowalski's paper and the 41-hour average, and decided that this was exactly the kind of event the paper had been about. She had loaded the firebox with split hedge apple, set the damper for a long, slow burn, and gone to make coffee. The power went out at 9:47 in the morning. The propane furnace's blower stopped. The thermostat dropped off its display. The house was already 68 degrees, and the Monarch was running at full output, and the mudroom and the kitchen and the living room, which shared the chimney wall, were warm. Gunnar Lindgren came into the mudroom and looked at the stove and looked at his daughter and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How much wood do we have?" Nora said, 8 cords. Gunnar said, "How long will that last?" Nora said, "At this burn rate, about 40 days. Gunnar nodded. He went and got his coat and went out to the shed to check the stack himself, the way a farmer checks things even when he's already been told the answer, because the land teaches you that first-hand knowledge is worth more than second-hand certainty. He came back in and stamped the ice off his boots and said, "Stack's good." They kept the house at 64 degrees for the 4 days of the outage, which required feeding the stove every 4 to 5 hours, including twice through the night. Nora took the night shifts. She would wake at 2 in the morning and 3 in the morning and come into the mudroom in her wool socks and her father's old canvas barn coat, and open the firebox and lay in 2 splits of hedge apple and adjust the damper, and stand for a moment in the orange light of the fire before going back to bed. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was warm, and warm was the only thing that mattered. On the second day, Gunnar's neighbor to the east, a man named Harold Peterson, who was 72 years old and had lived alone since his wife passed in 2018, called to say that his furnace had quit and the house was at 44 degrees. Gunnar told him to come over. Harold came over with his dog and a bag of clothes and stayed for 3 days. On the third day, Harold's daughter called from Topeka, and Gunner told her Harold was fine and eating supper and watching the news, and she started crying on the phone. Gunner handed the phone to Nora. On the third day, Britt Lindgren made a pot of soup big enough to fill a stock pot, and Nora drove it in the truck, carefully, on the ice, to the warming shelter at the high school, where the gymnasium had 200 people in it and smelled like wet coats and institutional coffee. She carried the pot in through the side door and set it on a table, and a woman from the county emergency office said, "God bless you," and meant it. On the fourth day, the temperature rose above zero for the first time. By Sunday afternoon, it was 18 degrees, which felt almost warm. The power came back on in the Lindgren neighborhood at 4:15 in the afternoon. The propane pressure recovered enough for the furnace to restart by Sunday evening. Gunner turned the thermostat up, and they listened to the furnace cycle on and stood in the kitchen in the warmth of it, and nobody said anything for a while. Then Gunner said, "How much wood did we use?" Nora said, "About half a cord." Gunner said, "We have 7.5 cords left." Nora said yes. Gunner looked at the floor for a moment. He said, "I should have done this 10 years ago." Nora didn't say anything. She had learned, in the 2 years since coming home from college, that her father's acknowledgments were quiet and infrequent and worth more for that reason. She just nodded. "Let me tell you about what happened in the weeks after the ice storm, because the story doesn't end with the power coming back on. The county damage assessment took 3 weeks to complete. When it was done, the numbers were stark. The 4-day outage had caused heating failures in 412 households. Of those, 61 had reported property damage from frozen pipes, with an average repair cost of $4,200. 11 families had been displaced from their homes for more than 2 weeks. The county warming shelter had served 847 individual visits over the 4 days. Total estimated economic damage to residential heating infrastructure in Marshall County was $1.7 million, not counting the cost of emergency propane deliveries, which had been trucked in from Salina at emergency rates once the roads cleared. Nora had all of these numbers. She had requested the assessment report from the County Emergency Management Office, which had provided it without hesitation because nobody else had asked for it. She had also pulled the county assessor's records on residential heating system types, which were public information, and she had cross-referenced them with the outage map to produce a document that showed, address by address, which heating systems had failed and which had not. The document showed that of the 412 households that reported heating failures, 408 used either propane, natural gas, or electric heat pump systems. The remaining 4 used wood-burning systems as primary or backup heat. None of those 4 households had reported a heating failure. Nora put that document in a folder and drove to the Marysville Co-op on a Tuesday morning in March. Dale Crowley was at the counter. Let me tell you about that Tuesday morning because it is the scene that everyone who was there remembers, and because it did not go the way Dale Crowley expected it to. There were 6 men at the co-op counter when Nora came in. Dale was on his stool. He had a cup of coffee. He looked up when she came in, and his expression shifted in a way that was hard to name, a slight tightening around the eyes that might have been recognition or might have been the beginning of something else. Nora set the folder on the counter and opened it and said, "I wanted to show you something." Dale looked at the folder. He said, "I'm kind of in the middle of something." Nora said she understood, and it would only take a minute. She turned the document so he could read it and said, This is the county heating failure assessment from the February outage. 412 households reported heating failures. 408 of them were on propane, natural gas, or electric heat pump systems. She put her finger on the relevant column. 4 households had wood-burning backup systems. None of them reported failures. The counter was quiet. Dale looked at the document. He looked at it for longer than he needed to if he was going to dismiss it. He said, "That's 4 households." Nora said, "Yes." He said, "That's not a statistically significant sample." Nora said, "It's 100% of the households in the county with wood-burning backup systems, and they had a 0% failure rate during a 4-day outage that produced an 88% failure rate among all other system types. I'd be happy to discuss the statistical methodology if you want to, but the numbers are the numbers." Dale said, "Wood heat is a fire hazard." Nora said, "The National Fire Protection Association data for 2019 shows that properly maintained solid fuel heating appliances have a lower residential fire incidence rate per household than portable electric space heaters, which are the most common alternative people use when their central heat fails. The fires in this county during the February outage were from portable electric heaters, not wood stoves." One of the men at the counter, a farmer named Ed Sorensen, who had spent 3 nights at the warming shelter, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite agreement, but was somewhere between the two. Dale said, "I've been heating houses in this county for 26 years. Nora said, "I know. You installed our furnace in 2009. It's a good furnace. It was off for 4 days in February." She paused. She said, "You told me last June that nobody heats with wood anymore because we have better options. I've been thinking about that. I think the question is better at what? Better at efficiency, yes. Better at resilience, no. And in a county where we've had 11 significant outages in 30 years with an average duration of 41 hours, I think resilience is worth something." Dale Crowley looked at the document for a long moment. The counter was very quiet. His coffee cup was in his hand, and he set it down on the counter with a small, careful motion, the way people set things down when they're thinking about something else. He said, "What do you want from me?" Nora said, "I want you to stop telling people they don't need a backup." Dale said nothing. Nora closed the folder. She said, "I'm not asking you to stop selling furnaces. I'm asking you to stop telling people that a good furnace means they don't need to think about what happens when it stops. Because it stops. You know it stops. The February numbers are right there." She picked up the folder. She said, "I have a meeting at the county extension office next week. I'm going to present this data and make the case for a county-wide residential heating resilience program. I'd like you to come." She walked out. Ed Sorensen watched her go. He looked at Dale. He said, "She's not wrong." Dale picked up his coffee cup. He looked at it. He said, "No, she's not." Let me tell you about the county extension meeting, because it was the moment this story moved from one family's farmhouse to something larger. The Marshall County Extension Office held its monthly community meeting on the second Wednesday of March. Nora had requested 15 minutes on the agenda to present her heating resilience data. She had prepared a 12-page summary document with the county failure assessment, the NFPA fire data, the BTU comparison table for regional hardwoods, and a cost-benefit analysis of wood stove restoration versus emergency shelter costs. She had also prepared a 1-page summary for people who didn't want to read 12 pages, which was most people. She stood at the front of the room in a room that held 31 people, which was more than the extension office usually drew for a Wednesday evening in March. Some of them had been at the warming shelter. Some of them had frozen pipes. Some of them had just heard that a 23-year-old woman from the Lindgren farm was going to tell them something about the ice storm that they hadn't thought of themselves. Dale Crowley was in the back row. Nora presented the data for 12 minutes without notes. She knew the numbers. She had been living with them for 6 weeks. She explained the difference between optimized systems and resilient systems in plain language, using the analogy of a car with excellent fuel economy that runs out of gas versus a car with worse fuel economy that has a full tank. She explained the BTU output of hedge apple and eastern red cedar and cottonwood, the 3 most available native hardwoods in Marshall County. She explained the cost of restoring a cast iron stove versus the cost of emergency shelter displacement. She said that the average cost of a wood stove restoration in the county, based on the 4 households she had surveyed, was $380. She said that the average cost of a heating failure in the county, based on the emergency management assessment, was $4,200 in property damage alone, not counting displacement costs or emergency fuel delivery premiums. She said, a $380 investment with a 100% success rate during a 4-day 11 below zero outage against a $4,200 average loss with an 88% failure rate. I'm not an economist, but those numbers seem worth talking about. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then a woman named Carol Rasmussen, who had spent 2 nights at the warming shelter with her 3 children while her husband tried to get their pipes thawed, raised her hand and said, "What do we do?" Nora said, "Find out if you have an old stove. If you do, let's look at it. If you don't, there are options." The Extension Office agreed that evening to sponsor a county-wide residential heating audit program, the first of its kind in Marshall County. Nora was appointed as the volunteer coordinator. Dale Crowley, who had sat in the back row through the entire presentation, stayed after the meeting ended. He waited until the room had mostly cleared. He walked up to where Nora was stacking her papers and he said, "I can help with the installation assessments." Nora looked at him. She said, "I thought you said nobody heats with wood anymore." Dale said, "I said a lot of things last June." He said it without looking away. "I was wrong about some of them." Nora said, "The meeting is next Tuesday at 7. Bring your truck." He brought his truck. Let me tell you about the 2 years that followed, because the story doesn't end with one meeting at the Extension Office, and because what happened in Marshall County over the next 24 months is the part of the story that Nora Lindgren would eventually stand up in front of a room in Topeka and describe to a committee of state legislators, and because it is the part that matters most. In the spring of 2021, the Marshall County Heating Resilience Program conducted 94 residential heating assessments across the county. Of those, 61 households had existing wood-burning appliances in some state of disrepair. Cast iron parlor stoves, kitchen ranges with firebox inserts, old coal-burning stoves converted to wood, one remarkable 1931 Gurney cabinet heater that had been in a barn for 40 years and needed only a new flue collar and a thorough cleaning to be operational. Of the 61, 47 were restored to working condition over the course of that spring and summer. Dale Crowley performed or supervised 23 of those restorations himself at no charge, which was not something anyone had asked him to do and which he did not announce or explain. The remaining 33 households that wanted backup heating but had no existing appliance were connected with a used wood stove program that Nora organized through a network of estate sales and farm auctions across 3 counties. The average cost of a used cast iron stove in good condition was $175. The average restoration cost was $210. Total investment per household, $385, which was $15 more than the average cost Nora had cited at the extension meeting. By the fall of 2021, 80 households in Marshall County had functioning wood-burning backup heating systems, up from 4 at the time of the February ice storm. Nora had personally assisted with 34 of those installations. Let me tell you about the winter of 2022 to 2023, because it is when the second test came. In December of 2022, a winter storm system moved through the Central Plains that was not as severe as the 2021 ice storm, but was severe enough. The temperature dropped to 4 below zero for 2 days. The power was out in the southern half of Marshall County for 31 hours. 11 households reported propane pressure failures. Of those 11, 7 had wood-burning backup systems installed through the Resilience Program. None of those 7 reported a heating emergency. The 4 that did not have backup systems called the county emergency line. 2 of them went to the warming shelter, which this time had 22 visitors instead of 847. The county emergency management director, a man named Phil Brockman, who had spent the 2021 storm coordinating the gymnasium shelter operation, sent Nora a letter after the 2022 storm. The letter said, in its entirety, "The difference between this winter and last winter is measurable. Thank you." Nora put the letter in the folder with the county assessment report and the NFPA data and the BTU comparison table. In the spring of 2023, she was invited to present the Marshall County program to the Kansas State Extension Service annual conference in Topeka. She drove there in her father's truck, which had 140,000 miles on it, wearing a Carhartt jacket that had a smear of boiler cement on the left sleeve from a stove restoration she had done the previous Saturday. She had a folder of data and a 12-minute presentation and no particular expectation of what would happen. What happened was that the room held 140 people, and they were quiet through the entire presentation, and at the end, a man from the Kansas Department of Emergency Management asked if she would be willing to consult on a statewide residential resilience initiative. She said she would. She drove home. Gunnar Lindgren was in the kitchen when she got back. He asked how it went. She said, "Fine." He said, "Did they listen?" She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Good." He went back to reading the farm report. That was all. That was enough. Let me tell you about the Monarch stove, because it is still there. It is still in the mudroom of the Lindgren farmhouse, in the same corner it has occupied since 1947. The firebox brick is new. The stovepipe is clean. The damper rod moves smoothly. There is a small stack of split hedge apple on the porch beside the back door. Enough for a week of continuous burning, kept there year-round. The propane furnace runs the house from October through April, efficiently and reliably, and nobody is suggesting it should be replaced. But the Monarch is ready. It has been ready every day since the spring of 2020 when Nora and her father spent a Saturday afternoon with a bag of boiler cement and a set of replacement bricks and the knowledge that ready was worth something. Arvid Lindgren heated this house with that stove for 22 years. He never lost a winter. His great-granddaughter knows why. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has a forward echo that Nora would tell you is the most important part. In the fall of 2023, Nora's younger brother Sven, who was 19 years old and had just started his second year at Kansas State studying agricultural engineering, came home for a weekend and sat down at the kitchen table with a folder of his own. He had been reading about passive solar design and residential farm structures. He had a professor at K-State named Dr. Marcus Webb, who had spent 15 years studying low-energy building retrofits in cold climates. Sven had a proposal. He wanted to add a thermal mass wall to the south face of the farmhouse, a trombe wall design using salvaged brick from the old dairy barn foundation that would capture solar gain during the day and release it as radiant heat at night, reducing propane consumption by an estimated 18 to 22%, and providing an additional passive heat buffer during outages. He laid the folder on the table. He looked at his father. He looked at his sister. Nora said, "How much would it cost?" Sven said, "About $800 in materials. Most of the brick is already on the property." Nora looked at the folder. She looked at her brother. She said, "Yes." Gunnar Lindgren looked at his two children across the kitchen table. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Show me the plans." That is what happens when a family decides that ready is worth something. That is what happens when a 23-year-old woman with a folder of data and a bag of boiler cement and a stove that everyone else had decided was obsolete sits down at a kitchen table and asks why. That is what happens when the ice comes and the grid fails and the county freezes and one farmhouse stays warm because someone paid attention to the difference between a system that works well and a system that keeps working. The monarch is still there. The hedge apple is stacked on the porch. The folder is in the drawer. They laughed when she kept the wood stove. Then the ice storm came. The grid went down. The furnaces quit. The stove burned. And the Lindgren house was the warmest place in the county.